that last way. We've talked about our somatic nervous system, right, which is our conscious control, our autonomic nervous system, which is our subconscious control. Cells also have a level of control where they kind of communicate right next to each other. You know, all the cells, they kind of know what each other's doing, and that's a form of communication called paracrine communication. It's kind of automatically done. Sometimes it's just called auto-regulation. This is just kind of a summary of everything, regulation in the body. So we had the nervous system, and we had somatic and the autonomic. When we talked about tissues and cells, briefly we mentioned how they kind of communicate through gap junctions and things like that. So that's what we call auto-regulation, which is just cell to cell communication. They kind of know what each other's doing. And then we have the endocrine, which is what we're going to talk about here. So big differences are things like our autonomic nervous system. Obviously, we understand the difference between somatic and autonomic, hopefully at this point. But this is for short-term change. You know, like my butt's hurting in this chair, I'm going to shift a little bit, that type of a thing. Or I can't hear, so I'm going to turn the volume up. Right? So, some type of immediate change to maintain homeostasis, something quick. Right? Quick, rapid response. Cell to cell, right? This is more for cell growth and all of those kind of little things that go on at the cellular level. Things like protein synthesis, things that we're totally not consciously aware of at all. Right? Cell growth, cell repair, right? All of those things that happen at literally at the cellular level, right? They all kind of communicate and talk to each other. The endocrine system is totally different than both of those. This is for long-term change, and this is slow. It's slow release, it's slow change. Nervous system, you want it to be louder, you turn it up, right? You're cold, you put on a coat. Endocrine system, something's going on, a chemical's released that causes another chemical to be released that causes another chemical to release that slowly brings about change, right? So the endocrine system is very complex, just like our nervous system, but it does this change in a different way. It uses chemical messengers instead of communicating by axons, right? So in the nervous system, we're communicating through axons. Here, we're communicating through hormones, right? These chemical messengers. And so that's what we're going to get into in this chapter, looking at those chemical messengers, right? First, let's understand what hormones are. So hormones interact with specific target cells. In general, our endocrine organs are releasing the hormones into the interstitial fluid. I kind of think of them as like standing in the corner and just spraying their hormone, right? And eventually that hormone makes it to all corners of the room. That's kind of how they work in your body. They sit in their little area and they spread out their little hormone, and it goes in the blood, and then it goes to wherever it needs to go. The hormones go all over your body, but they only act on certain tissues. Those tissues that they act on are called target tissues. So the target tissues are the specialized tissue that's meant to respond to that hormone. Let me give you an example. Estrogen is a hormone. Estrogen is a hormone. It affects your calcium absorption. It affects how you see light. It affects parts of your cardiovascular system. Estrogen is released from your ovaries, ladies, and it's also released from parts of your adrenal gland, guys, so even guys have resting levels of estrogen. It floats around in your blood, right? It floats around your blood, and it comes in contact with everything that your blood comes in contact with. So as your blood is, say, being filtered by your kidney, the estrogen just kind of goes by and says, oh, hi, kidney, I'm just cruising on through. It doesn't do anything there because the kidney is not a target tissue for estrogen, right? But when estrogen gets to your breast tissue, it says, oh, hey, honey, I'm home, right? And it gets to work doing whatever it does in the breast tissue, right? And so that would be an example of a target tissue or target cell for that hormone. And ultimately, these hormones work to regulate metabolism, control growth, and maintain homeostasis. That's what they're all about. But they only work on those specific cells that they're designed for. So we mentioned the nervous system uses neurotransmitters. We can add this to our little chart if we want. NT, right, neurotransmitter. Here we can introduce the word hormone, right? Our endocrine system also secretes into the interstitial fluid, right, like the blood. Whereas our nervous system are using axons to communicate. I mean, we can go on and on. We can add postsynaptic cell, target cell, right? Those are some other terms that we can add to our little chart so that we understand how they work. One of the major differences, though, is what we addressed already, is the fact that the effects of hormones can be long-lasting. Once a hormone is released, it can take weeks or maybe even months for the effect of that hormone to go away, right? Once an action potential is sent, it's done, right? It doesn't take weeks or months for the effect of that action potential to disappear, but hormones are much longer lasting. They can last a few hours in your blood. They can last a few weeks, depending on where they are. So this is just showing you the general comparison between the nervous system and the endocrine system. Here we're looking at how hormones travel in the blood. Maybe they can affect the heart. Maybe they can go down and affect different target tissue cells. So they're released into the interstitial fluid, travel in the blood, and go to wherever they need to go. Whoops. Go to wherever they need to go in the body. All I want for Christmas is a smart board that doesn't do this to me. And you guys make that happen. It's awful. It's actually way better in this class than it is in my other class. Oh my gosh, please just stop.
Will you change the view?
Yes, I will change the view. Thank you. That'll fix it. No. Thank you for reminding me. Okay, so we mentioned paracrine already. Paracrine are the types of secretions where cells are communicating with other cells. So we can stick that under here under autoregulation. Call it paracrine. This is cell to other cells. There's also something called autocrine, which is cell to the same cell or the same tissue. So it's just other cell messengers communicating with each other, letting each other know kind of what's going on. So this is showing you the difference between endocrine, paracrine, and autocrine, right? Endocrine goes into the blood, it's secreted from a hormone, it's secreted from a gland, travels in the blood, goes to a target cell. Paracrine is secreted by a cell, travels just in the extracellular fluid, right, and goes to another cell, but of a different kind, right? Autocrine is where that message is kind of being sent either to the same cell or to a cell of a similar tissue, right? Maybe a cell a couple cells away, right? Somewhere else in that same tissue. So we have a couple different types of endocrine glands. We have primary and we have secondary. So secondary endocrine glands are ones that have a non-endocrine function. So some of our organs, like our heart, for example, acts as an organ of our cardiovascular system, but it also secretes hormones. So some of our non-endocrine organs have an endocrine function, right? And so in this chapter, we're going to cover all of the different endocrine organs and the hormones that they secrete and the effects of their on our body. That's our main objective here. These are our primary endocrine organs. So our primary endocrine organs, these all have, their number one role is endocrine related. They produce hormones, right? The anterior pituitary, the thyroid gland, the parathyroid gland, the adrenal gland. There's part of your pancreas called the endocrine pancreas. We'll talk about that. The other part of your pancreas has a digestive role, right? And the thymus. So this is just showing you kind of where they are. Secondary organs would include the heart, the kidneys, our adipose tissue, the testes, the ovaries, right? Our hypothalamus and pineal gland are also considered secondary organs because they have other roles. This is just showing you some of them throughout the body. And obviously in lab, you'll have to identify these on the torso models. And then we also have a little bit of histology related to these. We'll cover that in lab next week. So let's talk about how these hormones work. So hormones are chemical messengers, as we mentioned. They're released directly from the gland into the interstitial fluid. And they actually kind of can impact cells in two different ways. So we'll look at how they work. We have amino acid hormones. Right? Amino acid hormones. These are obviously made from amino acids, right? You eat something that has protein in it, your body breaks it down, digests it, you absorb it, and then your cells take apart those proteins and use it to make amino acid hormones. So amino acid hormones, these are things that can be protein hormones or peptide hormones, but basically they bind to the plasma membrane of their target cell. So we tend to think of hormones as kind of coming along, maybe binding, maybe going into the cell and taking over that cell. But some of them just kind of function from the outside. And an amino acid hormone would be like that. It comes along, kind of velcros itself to the outside of the target tissue cell, and it's going to command whatever the cell does from the outside. It's going to direct cell activities from the outside. Steroid hormones are another type. Steroid hormones go into the cell. They're going to invade the cell and take over the cell from the inside. They can either bind directly to the nucleus or kind of situate themselves within the cytoplasm to kind of take over. Hormones can also be free-floating, and we call them plasma protein carriers. Free hormones can actually kind of travel around the blood and affect how your blood responds and what your blood does. And so we'll look at some of these as we go in a case-by-case basis, but they'll actually kind of be carried in a little protein boat, if you will. So we'll look at those. Sometimes they're bound hormones. A bound hormone would be one that kind of joins up with other hormones in order to be transported. So it can't float through the blood by itself. So these are mostly our steroid hormones, right? Remember our blood is mostly water. So you can't put something in our blood that's lipid-based, right? It will repel the surrounding fluid. So it needs to be surrounded or bound to something that can carry it through. And so that's what bound hormones are. Bound hormones are ones that are connected to or bound to other proteins or other molecules that help it dissolve in the blood plasma so they can get where they need to go. These, because they're kind of protected and surrounded, can last for a much longer time in your blood than the free. So this is just showing the hormone action, how they work, right? So this one would be one that binds to a receptor. Take a look at what happens. Can I zoom in this way? A little bit, maybe. Okay, it binds to the receptor, and then inside the cell, a chemical change takes place, right? It activates something called a G protein. A G protein is this idea of it's like a little messenger. Kind of like knocking on the door and saying, "Hi, honey, is your mom home? Can I see her?" Right? And so the G protein goes and gets the mom, right? Goes and gets the dad, right? Just a little messenger. The C-AMP, or cyclic AMP, is the molecule that actually does stuff. This is the molecule that's going to activate enzymes, that's going to change the metabolism of the cell. Remember, hormones do one major thing, and that is regulate the metabolic activity of that cell that they're targeting. And they do that by binding to the outside and ultimately activating this cyclic AMP. And this cyclic AMP causes a chain of reactions that's going to regulate this cell. It's going to turn on different genes or turn off different genes or make the cell more permeable to sodium or make the cell less permeable to sodium, or make the cell more permeable to calcium, or make it bring in more glucose, right? That's what these hormones do. This is how they work. They're going to literally, thank you, PowerPoint, literally change what goes on inside of our cell. Well, let me make this smaller.
Is the line sign at the bottom of right side?
I would if this mouse was so the computer's like freaking out right now, which happens in my other class. So it's not letting me move or click anything. Let's just kind of turn this off and restart it. That's what happens to me pretty much every day. And it's one of those things where I tell the dude, I'm like, oh hey, this does this, it doesn't work. And whenever they come, of course it works fine, and so they think that I'm just crazy. There we go. It's letting me do it now. It just needs to warm up. So, the two main ways that hormones work. Bind to the outside. The second way is when they actually invade. They actually go into the cell. And so this is going to be most of what we call the hydrophobic hormones, or those steroid hormones, the ones that are lipid-based or lipid-soluble. Those will actually go in, they come in through the cell membrane, and they can bind to receptors on the nucleus, or they just kind of camp out in the cytoplasm itself. So they don't need that G protein, they don't need that second messenger in there. They just bang down the door and go right in and get done what they need to get done. And so that's what this one is, right? It goes in, binds, and ultimately it's going to direct the metabolic activities. And these hormones do this by dominating and controlling which genes are turned on and off, right? Turning on different genes. That's how they function. So, ultimately, effects of hormones. They're going to be secreted. They can bind to and activate or inhibit enzymes. So they can boost what an enzyme does or turn off an enzyme. They can stimulate or inhibit mitosis or meiosis, so it's stimulate cell division or inhibit cell division. They're going to open and close ion channels, activate ion channels or deactivate ion channels, right? They can also activate or inhibit transcription, or activate or inhibit protein synthesis. In other words, turn genes on or turn genes off, right? So there's different hormones that are secreted throughout, I'll give you an example, throughout our digestive system, right? They play a role in how we break down different sugars and proteins and lipids and things like that. And milk has a sugar in it, right, called lactose, and we need to produce the enzyme lactase in order for our bodies to metabolize lactose. Is anyone in here lactose intolerant? It's a pretty common thing. So lactose intolerant just means, obviously, that your body does not make that enzyme lactase. Well, for those of us that are not lactose intolerant, if you're not drinking milk, your body's not using energy to create lactase, right? Your body's only going to make the lactase enzyme when lactose is present. So if you go years without drinking milk and then all of a sudden have some milk or dairy products, your body's going to be like, whoa, all right, I need some time to adjust to this. I need to go ahead and start making some lactase, right? And so the first time you have milk or dairy products, if you haven't had them in a while, your stomach might be a little upset because it's not used to those things. That's because when you're digesting, your stomach, your intestines detect those chemicals and secrete hormones that turn on the production of lactose, or lactase rather, turn on the production of lipases, turn on the production of proteases, and all of the digestive enzymes that you need to digest those foods. So if you're not eating those foods, then your body's not producing those enzymes because the hormones aren't telling it to, right? So when you put that lactose into your body, hormones are secreted that tells your cells to make lactase, and you can do it, right? But otherwise, it's not going to be done. So hormones can actually interact with each other too. They get very complex. And you know this if you've ever known someone that has had an endocrine disorder or someone who has had to do hormone replacement therapy or anything like that. So hormones can actually work together. They can be what's called synergists, where they kind of boost each other's action. So examples of a synergist would be something like growth hormone. Growth hormone is a metabolic hormone which increases, how do I want to say this? It increases the rate at which your body is kind of burning fuel, the rate at which your body's metabolizing food and breaking down food. And thyroid hormone does the same thing. And so together, growth hormone and thyroid hormone work together to create this kind of engine in your body that can burn through food and use it to make lots and lots of ATP so your cells can do lots of things, right? So we call them synergists. Antagonists have the opposing effects. We've talked about an antagonistic hormone relationship before when we did bone physiology at the beginning of the semester. Do you remember calcitonin and parathyroid hormone? One of them raises blood calcium levels, one of them lowers blood calcium levels, right? Parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium levels, calcitonin decreases blood calcium levels. Those are antagonists. They work on the same types of cells, but they have opposing effects. So, these hormones are regulated in 3 different ways. Something called hormonal stimuli. In other words, a hormone tells the hormone to be released. Right? So there's kind of a chain reaction of hormones. One hormone released tells another hormone to be released, tells another hormone to be released. Sometimes it's humoral. In other words, a concentration of an ion, maybe, or a concentration of something in the blood, maybe, stimulates the secretion of that. That would be the example in calcitonin and parathyroid hormone, right? Those are stimulated by unequal or unstable blood calcium levels, right? When blood calcium level drops, parathyroid hormone is released. That's a humoral stimuli. There's also neural stimuli, where there's actual neurons firing that say, hey, you need to secrete this right now, right? So an action potential sent to the gland, and the gland releases a hormone because it's told to. So we'll look at some examples of all of these, right? So this is hormonal stimuli, right? One hormone coming and telling it to release another. So in this case, GnRH is telling this cell to release GH, growth hormone. Here's a humoral stimuli. Maybe blood glucose levels are too high, so insulin is secreted to lower blood glucose levels. And neural stimulation is when a neuron is actually telling the cells to release something. So an example there would be under like sympathetic activation, your fight or flight. You want to get some adrenaline pumping in your body, get that sympathetic feeling going on. So your sympathetic neurons will tell your adrenal cortex to go ahead and release some epinephrine into your blood to kind of alert all of the troops, so to speak. So ultimately, no matter how these are told to be turned on, whether it's humoral, hormonal, or neural, they're all regulated through feedback, all of them. So there's few exceptions, but almost all of this is negative feedback. So remember that feedback loop that we talked about like the first day of class, where you have a stimulus and a receptor and a control center and an effector, right? That feedback loop of homeostasis. That's what we're going to see here again in the endocrine system. You have some type of stimulus that's being detected by a receptor. It's going to be regulated by a control center, and then some response is going to be carried out by the effector. So we'll look at these feedback loops in most of these scenarios that we're going to talk about. With most of these hormones, we'll go through and we'll look at what the effector is, what the receptor is, what the control center is. We'll kind of go through and discuss each of them. The control center and effector, but ultimately your body does all of this to stay within homeostatic range, right? Your body's doing all of this, regulating all of this communication, cell to cell, neural, hormonal, to maintain homeostasis, right? We got to keep our blood pH at 735, 745. We have to keep our blood glucose levels at a certain level. We have to keep our sodium concentration at a certain level, our water concentration at a certain level. So hormones all help with that. So example here, stimulus, some type of physiological response. You get out of your normal range for something. The receptor detects that. It's all regulated by a control center. Your control center says, aha, I know what to do. Before, we're used to thinking of the brain as a control center, which you'll see that it can be in this case. But your brain is not always the control center when it comes to endocrine regulation. There's other organs in there that play a role. Then we have some type of response, or an effector is going to release something, or absorb something, or secrete something in response. And then you get back to your homeostatic range, your normal. Right? And your normal could be different than other people's normals. Everyone's body chemistry is different, and this is where it gets really complex. Going back to, again, if you know someone that's ever been on hormone therapy, or if they've had maybe their thyroid gland removed, or their ovaries removed, or whatever, finding the right levels of hormones for your body can be tricky, because every body is different, and your body might respond to a synthetic hormone very differently than someone else. Even birth control, that's another example there, because those are synthetic hormones also. So ultimately, all of this is controlled by your hypothalamus. Your hypothalamus is your main homeostatic center. Remember that? It was the seat of our autonomic nervous system. It's also the seat of our hormones. All right, so none of our hormone regulation would be possible without a normal functioning hypothalamus. This is where all of the feedback loops ultimately come back to. Remember, the hypothalamus has a small break in the blood-brain barrier. So your hypothalamus can kind of dipstick and taste your blood and check for different things. Check for glucose levels, check for ion levels, check for pH, check for all of the things that need to be regulated. And so your hypothalamus is going to play a super important role here. Bless you. So there's just revisiting our hypothalamus, right? We can think about naming these structures, reviewing for our practical, right? Corpus callosum, right? That lateral ventricle right under there. You see that intrathalamic adhesion or intermediate mass, the button, right? Which tells us there's the thalamus, and then we go forward and down from the thalamus. We get to the hypothalamus. You can also recognize the hypothalamus because the pituitary gland is hanging right off of it, right? And most of the models in lab, unfortunately, do not have a pituitary, so that can get tricky. Speaking of pituitary, it's divided into anterior and posterior. It has a front half and a back half. And when you look in lab, you see there's two colors to it. It's usually like pink and white or something like that on at least the sagittal skull model. That anterior pituitary is sometimes called the adenohypophysis. This sits, remember there was a structure of your bones called the hypophyseal fossa. Does that sound familiar? Should. The hypophyseal fossa, hypophyseal, right? Hypophysis, that's referring to the pituitary gland. This is the area that kind of cradles the pituitary gland. So that Turkish saddle, right, that sella turcica, literally holds your pituitary gland. That's where your pituitary gland sits in your cranium. The anterior pituitary is our hormone-producing, hormone-secreting part of our pituitary. The posterior pituitary is actually neural tissue. It's actually an extension of the hypothalamus that kind of dips down next to the anterior pituitary. So they're regulated very, very differently. You can see them here, right? Hypothalamus, and then we have this gland tissue, and then the neurohypophysis, or our posterior pituitary, which is made of neural tissue. It's an extension of the hypothalamus. So these are regulated very differently. Our posterior pituitary, because it's just an extension of the hypothalamus, it's just regulated through neural control. Neurons are extending down from the hypothalamus, controlling whatever it is this posterior pituitary does. The anterior pituitary is regulated very differently. It's regulated in something called a portal system. So the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system is what it's called. It's like a little circulatory system. It's a loop, right, that communicates through hormones. It sends releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones through this portal system. So there's tiny, tiny capillaries in there that allow your hypothalamus and pituitary to communicate together. So I'm gonna sketch that out for you so you understand what I'm talking about. This is not gonna look right. here's the hypothalamus. And here is anterior. This looks all kinds of weird. That's all right. This is anterior pituitary. Posterior pituitary. All right, so posterior pituitary is literally an extension of our hypothalamus. So this is just literally under neural control. However, our anterior pituitary has a circulatory system that's going to exchange, I drew it red for blood. It's literally like capillaries. It's called the portal system, hypophyseal portal system. So our posterior pituitary releases two hormones. When the hypothalamus, which is ultimately in control of all this, when the hypothalamus wants your posterior pituitary to secrete something, it just says boom, right? It sends an action potential, and your posterior pituitary sends that signal, right? It sends the hormone. But when your anterior pituitary needs to release something, there's no neuron coming down here. Instead, there's a circulatory path, this portal system. The portal system will release something called a tropic hormone. It will release a releasing hormone or an inhibiting hormone. Let me give you an example. One of the hormones that's secreted from our anterior pituitary is called thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. It literally stimulates the thyroid. That's one of the cool things about the endocrine system, is they're mostly named after exactly what they do. So thyroid stimulating hormone or TSH comes from the anterior pituitary. But before it can come from the anterior pituitary, it has to be told when and how to be released. And that's what this portal system does. The portal system will communicate through hormone down to the anterior pituitary. So there's a hormone that tells the anterior pituitary to release a hormone. It's called TRH. It stands for like thyrotropic releasing hormone. It's a pretty big word, so we can just learn abbreviations, that's fine. So TRH from the hypothalamus travels through the portal system. Our anterior pituitary then releases our thyroid stimulating hormone. Well, guess where thyroid stimulating hormone goes? Into the blood. Right, just that's what hormones do. They go into the interstitial fluid, they go into the blood. So it's going to travel into the blood, and where does it go? Where's the target tissue of thyroid stimulating hormone?
Thyroid.
The thyroid. It goes to the thyroid. And guess what our thyroid releases?
Parathyroid.
Thyroid hormone. It's just called thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone is released into the blood. Thyroid hormone, the target tissue of thyroid hormone is every cell in your body. And what thyroid hormone does is it increases metabolism. I'm summarizing, there's more to it, but we'll just say that it increases metabolism for simplicity's sake. So in this pathway, there is 1, 2, 3 hormones. A hormone tells a hormone to be released, which tells another hormone to be released. Right? Ultimately, the command's coming from the hypothalamus. Right? So if we want to be more specific, our hypothalamus does that. Hypothalamus directs our anterior pituitary, which directs our thyroid gland, which directs the thyroid to release. then guess what happens? Our blood thyroid levels increase. We have lots of thyroid hormone hopping around in our blood. Is this releasing hormone going to keep telling our anterior pituitary to keep releasing, 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 releasing? Look what else it releases. Our hypothalamus not only releases releasing hormones, it also releases inhibiting hormones, right? See, this is what it does. It freaks out. That's just par for the course. So after our blood hormone levels rise of thyroid hormone, thyroid inhibiting hormone would be released, which blocks this whole process, right? That's that homeostatic regulation. That's that feedback system, right? That's that turning on the switch and then turning off the switch. So inhibiting hormone would be released, which turns off this whole process. So yeah, this is what it does pretty much for an hour and 20 minutes in my other class. Okay, let's talk about the hormones of our posterior pituitary. So these hormones are actually produced by the hypothalamus, but then they're released by our posterior pituitary. They're stored in the posterior pituitary and released. They're told to be released when the hypothalamus says, whoop, release this. And there's two. One is called antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, and one of them is called oxytocin. So there's our, I'm going to have to restart it again. There's our posterior pituitary. Again, this is all done through neural control. An actual neuron says an action potential to our posterior pituitary. Release these. Antidiuretic hormone is also called vasopressin. Vasopressin is going to do the opposite of what a diuretic does. Have you ever heard of a diuretic pill? Maybe you've taken diuretic pills. Hopefully you haven't abused diuretic pills, right? Diuretics are ones that help you get rid of fluid, right? So a lot of people that are wrestlers or bodybuilders take diuretic pills to help them pee out all excess water so they can look really ripped, right? Or cut weight so they can make weight for wrestling or whatever. So antidiuretic hormone does the opposite. Antidiuretic hormone helps you retain water, right? It helps you keep the fluid. Right, which kind of sounds weird. Why would you want to retain water? But it goes back to this concept of volume in your body equals blood pressure. And if you don't have enough blood volume, then you have really low blood pressure, and that's deadly. Right? High blood pressure can be deadly also, but in a survival mentality, in normal everyday life, people that don't eat high sodium diets, right? We didn't evolve as a species eating McDonald's, right? So from a survival standpoint, we by nature don't have high blood pressure. Unfortunately, our diets give us high blood pressure because we eat poorly and make poor food choices. But antidiuretic hormone is there to help keep your blood pressure high so that you can maintain your blood pressure and blood volume. So it helps you retain water. And so the way it does this is by it's directly released from our posterior pituitary, and it goes down and it actually affects your kidneys. It affects water reabsorption at the kidneys. So you'll learn exactly how this functions next semester. We'll talk a little bit more about it when we get to homeostatic regulation in this chapter. But that's what ADH does. So it's basically allowing for these special aquaporins to go into the nephron, or the collecting system of our kidneys. Diabetes can actually cause a change in ADH secretion. So ADH can actually stop being secreted in people with diabetes, which is why one of the first symptoms of juvenile diabetes is frequent urination. It's because of that high glucose levels, and therefore kind of blocked ADH secretion. This is showing what it does. It's literally just helping to reabsorb water from our kidney tubules. Let's just talk about oxytocin real quick also, if this will function for me. There you go. Oxytocin is one of their other hormone from our posterior pituitary. And what oxytocin does is its main target cell is the uterus and mammary glands. And so it targets the smooth muscle of the uterus to bring about uterine contractions, promoting labor and delivery. The mammary glands are there, the function of the mammary glands for oxytocin is milk ejection. So there's a difference for, I'm assuming, I'll just make the assumption, nobody in here has ever nursed a newborn before, but there's a difference between milk production and milk ejection. And one of the reasons a lot of doctors will say and kind of lean you towards nursing, even though I'm not like debating formula feeding versus breastfeeding, but one of the reasons breastfeeding can be helpful postpartum is because it actually helps your uterus contract back down to what its normal size is. The uterus, and we can talk about this for days and days, but the uterus is only about the size of your thumb, which is crazy to think about. But obviously, when you have a baby in there, it's much, much bigger than your thumb. And so after you deliver, it has to contract back down. And the act of breastfeeding releases oxytocin, which helps your uterus contract back down, which helps you kind of return to somewhat normalcy after childbirth. So that suckling of the newborn releases the oxytocin, which causes the uterus to contract, and so on and so forth. So it's actually a positive feedback loop in this case, instead of a negative feedback loop. So we'll stop there for today, and that's just showing posterior pituitary. We'll do anterior pituitary and all the other hormones next class.